Hi, I'm Laura Brophy. I direct the Estuary Technical Group at the Institute for Applied Ecology in Corvallis, Oregon, and I'm also a faculty member at Oregon State. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk with you today about our project comparing losses of tidal forests and tidal marshes on the Oregon coast and what it means for fish. So these projects my talk today is going to cover projects that were funded by quite a few different entities and involved collaboration from a number of groups. So I'm grateful to all of them, particularly PMEP, which coordinated and funded some of the core work here. I want to let you know about the historical diversity of our tidal wetland habitats in Oregon estuaries and how they benefited fish. Also, I want to talk a little about how our estuaries have changed over the years and how we can use this information to better plan our estuary restoration activities to support fish population resilience. Starting with the historical diversity topic, vegetated tidal wetlands, which are the usual subjects for restoration activities on our coast, include the lower intertidal, like seagrasses and algae beds shown on the left, and then the tidal marsh in the center that's most familiar to people. Then the shrub and forested tidal swamps are shown on the right here. And I'm going to show you just a couple more pictures of tidal swamps because they're not as familiar to a lot of people. This is a brackish Sitka spruce tidal swamp in the Nehalem, another in the Aquinnah, and some freshwater tidal swamps, cottonwood and ash in the Columbia River. Here are some shrub swamps in the Siuslaw. This one's low brackish, and then a freshwater tidal swamp in the Columbia system. So the study that I'm going to focus on today that covers these historical conditions and current status for these wetland habitat types is this one that I completed in December 2019. And we measured the changes in these three major habitat types, emergent, shrub, and forested, between historical times and current. And this study was conducted within 15 major estuaries on the Oregon coast that constitute 97% of the historical tidal wetland area. Inputs to this analysis included PMEP's estuary extent that you heard about in the last talk, and PMEP's biotic component, and then historical vegetation maps. And we used these different data sources to understand change in the following way. In the upper left panel of this slide, you can see the historical estuary extent that we defined using the elevation-based mapping method. So it's a contour, as you can see on this. This is a LiDAR digital elevation. Then we looked inside that contour to see what conditions were like historically and currently. So it's really helpful having that boundary. For instance, we could look for diked areas like these orange areas, and then we could look at historical vegetation versus current. Major change from forested to emergent there. And this is how we look at two different types of loss due to diking and tidal disconnection on the top, and then loss due to vegetation change in the bottom of this slide. What we learned was that historically, over half of the Oregon coast's tidal wetlands were forested. Knowing this really pushes us in a different direction for our restoration and conservation activities. We have to broaden our focus from the tidal marsh that's usually been the subject of restoration into looking at restoring tidal swamps as well. This is a map from the study showing how these wetland types are arrayed across the tidal landscape. So this is the Siuslaw River estuary, and in green are shown the tidal swamps, and in orange, the tidal marsh. So you can see that a high proportion, in fact, 75% of the historical tidal wetland in the Siuslaw was swamp versus 25% marsh. And the Coquille estuary, we're in the Columbia here, has found a similar, researchers have found a similar preponderance of forested tidal wetlands there. 53% of the historical tidal wetland area was shrub or forested swamp, 47% tidal marsh. So how did these diverse estuarine habitats benefit fish? Well, the first thing to remember is, as Greg Hood and his colleagues pointed out in 2018, fish habitat isn't just tidal channels, it's also tidal marsh. In other words, the wetland itself is fish habitat. And we broaden that to note that it's not just tidal marsh, but all kinds of tidal wetlands, including the shrub and forested tidal swamps. they provide some pretty interesting characteristics and very good ones for fish habitat, like deep, complex tidal channels with abundant large woody debris, rich salmon prey food sources, and often a lot of beaver activity. And as a result, low tide refuge where fish can shelter from high river velocities and storm events, as well as predators. And because these shrub and forested tidal wetlands occur in the low brackish, well, actually the mesohaline down to the freshwater tidal, they offer salt adjustment opportunities that help salmon survive in the open ocean. So Greg Hood studied how do Chinook use shrub tidal wetlands in the Skagit estuary up in Puget Sound, and he found that juvenile Chinook capacity at low tide was 3 times higher in shrub wetlands that had beaver pools compared to tidal marsh that lacked beaver pools. And he concluded that we really need to focus on restoring tidal shrub habitats to benefit salmon. Isa Wu and her team studied a mosaic, or you could call it a portfolio, of estuary habitat types, and found that they support a diversified fish population. This diagram shows how fish diets varied among the different habitat classes that they studied. So on the left, you can see eelgrass and mudflats. Fish in those habitats ate mainly mysids, amphipods, decapods. However, fish that were rearing in tidal forest ate more insects and wasps. And that was quite a change or a difference between these habitat types. The tidal forests provided prey that were more the soft-bodied insects that are high energy prey. And Wu and her team concluded that the timing and the productivity and diversity of prey across these many different habitat types supports diverse life history strategies in salmon populations. You can imagine that that helps resilience. Corey Green and his team looked at how young Chinook use mudflat, marsh, shrub, and forested tidal wetlands in Puget Sound. Without going into too much detail on this chart, I just want to point out that the marsh, the shrub, and the forested habitats offer different types and levels of growth potential for young salmon, and their timing is different. So each of these habitats is important in different ways and at different times. And Green's team concluded that habitat diversity is important for maximizing growth potential of young salmon, and that we really need to focus in our restoration planning on habitat diversity as well as capacity to support fish population recovery and resilience. So how have our estuaries changed? What can we do to bring back this resilience and diversity that was once present? And again, this is going to take me back to that study I mentioned a minute ago that we completed in 2019. We learned that we've lost almost all of our forested tidal swamps from the Oregon coast. The loss has been 95% for tidal swamps, and the loss of tidal marsh, by contrast, was about 60%. So quite a big difference. This bar chart shows the same thing. So you can see historically 15,400 hectares of tidal wetland, less than half that total now. But the bulk of what was lost was tidal swamp. That went from 58% of the total to only 18% of the total now. Here's a detailed view for the south end of the Tillamook Bay estuary. So here's the bay in light gray. These darker gray areas were historically tidal marsh. The blue in this map represents areas that were historically tidal swamp, forested tidal swamp specifically, as opposed to shrub. And the red are the remaining tidal swamps now. So you can see there's not much left. Although almost two thirds of the historical tidal wetlands in the Tillamook were forested, 92% of those have been lost. So again, this is a huge change. And in the Coquille, the change was even more extreme. 84% of the Coquille River estuary's historical tidal wetlands were forested, but basically all of them have been lost. There's very, very little remaining in that estuary. Very little tidal swamp remaining. In the Columbia, other researchers have found fairly similar results. Here's the Columbia River flowing through its various hydrogeomorphic reaches to the ocean. And this bar chart shows the losses of forested, emergent, and shrub habitats from Reach B specifically, much higher for forested tidal swamps, 82% loss versus 31% for tidal emergent, that's tidal marsh, and 35% loss for tidal shrub wetlands. So how can we use this information to do a better job with our estuary restoration and better support the resilience of our fish populations? Well, the expert regional technical group in the Lower Columbia had some good principles that we can learn from. They stated their goal, the goal for the Lower Columbia, is to reestablish the continuity and complexity of the estuary landscape in time and in space. And they noted that historical conditions like the ones that I've been telling you about make a very useful template for defining our restoration goals and objectives. As an example, in river reaches A through D, they prioritized different habitat types for restoration. In reaches A and D, they prioritized herbaceous wetland or tidal marsh. Excuse me, this wasn't the the ERTAG specifically. This was the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnerships Restoration Plan, which followed guidance from the ERTAG. In reaches B and C, forested and shrub tidal wetlands were prioritized. And for the outer Oregon coast, as I mentioned in my 2019 report, given the really high losses of forested tidal swamps, those need to be a top priority for restoration activities. And in fact, there's a lot of groups that are prioritizing them now on the coast and working on restoring them. And so to follow that thought, how do we do this? How do we restore tidal swamps? And first, we have to choose an appropriate site, and that isn't always straightforward. And I would recommend you take a look at my 2019 report. There's an appendix in there that goes into some detail on how you can pick a good site for a tidal swamp restoration project. And then second, we do the basic things we need to do for any tidal wetland restoration, bring back the tidal flows and restore those channels that are so important for carrying the tides into the site. And then finally, of course, woody plantings are very important for restoring woody dominant vegetation. There are a few challenges that arise, though, when you try to restore tidal swamps. And one is that these soils are very highly organic. In fact, tidal swamps store more carbon than almost any other ecosystem on Earth. That's another talk. But as a result, when they undergo intensive land use or just agricultural land use in general, much of that organic matter burns off and the soils subside. They also compact. And so they end up lower than they were historically, which means you can't always restore tidal swamp where it used to be. You have to find an appropriate elevation. We also need to be very sure that we restore tidal channels, because a natural tidal wetland has 10 times the tidal channel length that a ditched system has in general. We found these tidal channels, the networks were incredibly complex, and it's very important to restore as much of that tidal channel network as we can to make sure all the biology that we see as a result of that structure can return. We do have problems with invasive species to some extent. Reed canary grass is a common problem in low salinity sites. And there are some interesting results or early results from some innovative methods to help address this problem. Nurse logs can be used. Young spruce trees can be planted in holes in nurse logs. And Jake Robinson has been using a log crib method on the Oregon coast, where he builds these cribs to elevate the young spruce above the reed canary grass and give it a chance, give it a head start. Heide Diefendorfer and her team looked at building constructed mounds within a wetland to elevate some surfaces above the general tidal wetland surface and give the young trees a chance to grow and get a head start again. You would, of course, plant those trees in these mounds. So I hope that I've explained to you some of the diversity that was present in our estuaries historically, and how that benefited fish, how our estuaries have changed, and then how we can use that information to do a better job restoring diversity to our estuary habitats and supporting the resilience of our fish populations. Thank you again for listening.